Her small fingers trembled as she grabbed the tattooed sleeve. Tears carved paths down her cheeks, her voice breaking with each desperate word. "My daddy's gone forever." The private room went dead silent. Wine glasses froze mid-air. Every hardened face turned. But the man she had chosen wasn't just any man. He was Lee Jun-suk, the monster of Seoul, the most feared mafia boss in South Korea. And what he did next would change everything. Stay until the very end because this story will leave you speechless. But first, if you're loving Mafia Moonlight Tales, smash that like button, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now let's dive in. It's a frigid winter evening in Gangnam, modern-day Seoul. The Red Dragon Korean barbecue restaurant hums with the controlled energy of powerful men conducting business over premium soju and hushed negotiations. This isn't just any restaurant. This is Lee Jun-suk's fortress. Every server knows to see nothing and remember less. Every guest understands the unwritten laws. You respect the hierarchy. You honor the silence. And you never, ever interrupt. Lee Jun-suk sits at his customary corner booth. A figure carved from ice and calculation whose mere presence bends the room to his will. At 38, he has built a criminal empire that reaches into every shadow of the city. His dark eyes register everything. His decisions are absolute. And tonight, like every Tuesday for the past decade, he is holding court with his most trusted lieutenants. The discussion flows in measured, deliberate tones. Money is accounted for. Districts are negotiated. Problems are solved with ruthless efficiency. This is how Jun-suk operates. Precise, controlled emotion sealed behind walls of steel. He has outlasted rivals and avoided prison because he learned one brutal truth early. Caring about anything makes you vulnerable. And vulnerability gets you destroyed. But then something happens that will shatter every defense Jun-suk has spent his life constructing. The restaurant's heavy wooden door crashes open with such violence that it ricochets off the wall. Every head snaps toward the sound. Conversations die instantly. The maitre d' rushes forward, horror painted across his face. But before he can intercept the intruder, everyone sees what has caused the disruption. A little girl, no older than 6, stands shaking in the entrance. Her pink dress is torn and streaked with dirt. Her natural curls are wild around a face wet with tears and smudged with grime. She looks like she has fought through hell itself to reach this place. The child's eyes scan the room frantically, searching for hope, for help, for someone who can make the nightmare stop. The restaurant's patrons stare back in stunned disbelief. Some avert their gaze, uncomfortable with this invasion of innocence into their dark world. Others mutter irritably, annoyed that their business has been interrupted by what appears to be some lost street child. But Nia Williams isn't lost. She's desperate. Her gaze locks onto Lee Jun-suk's table, and something in those young, terrified eyes recognizes power when she sees it. Perhaps it's the way grown men lean away from him with respect. Perhaps it's the dragon tattoo coiling up his neck or the expensive watch glinting under the dim lights. Or perhaps it's something primal. A child's survival instinct identifying the one person in this entire room who has the strength to save her father. Without hesitation, she runs directly toward him. The room collectively holds its breath. Jun-suk's bodyguards stiffen, hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons. This is unprecedented. No one approaches Lee Jun-suk uninvited, especially not like this. But before anyone can move, the little girl reaches Jun-suk's table and grabs his tattooed forearm with both tiny hands. Her fingers clutch the fabric of his designer suit as though it's the only thing keeping her from drowning. And then she speaks the words that will haunt the cold-blooded crime boss for the rest of his days. "My daddy's gone forever." The silence that crashes down is absolute. You could hear a heartbeat in that restaurant. Every eye fixes on Jun-suk, waiting to see how Seoul's most notorious criminal will handle this impossible moment. His reputation is built on being untouchable, unbreakable, a man who shows compassion to absolutely no one. Jun-suk looks down at the child clinging to his arm. Her face is turned upward, those brown eyes swimming with terror and fragile, impossible hope. In that frozen moment, something shifts deep in the gangster's chest, something he buried so long ago he thought it was dead. You see, Lee Jun-suk wasn't always the ruthless crime lord that Seoul whispers about in fear. Once many years ago he had been someone different, someone who understood the agony of losing everything that made life worth living. 20 years earlier, Jun-suk had a younger sister named Min-ji. She was his entire world. His reason for surviving their brutal childhood in the slums of Seoul. While their parents worked themselves to exhaustion, Jun-suk protected Min-ji from the violence and poverty that surrounded them. They made promises to each other, that one day they would escape, that one day life would be beautiful instead of brutal. But those promises were incinerated one night when a powerful gang decided to expand their territory through their neighborhood. They didn't negotiate. They didn't warn. They simply burned down buildings to send a message about who owned the streets. Jun-suk wasn't home when the fire started. He was working late at a construction site, earning money for Min-ji's schoolbooks. He came back to find his neighborhood consumed by flames, firefighters unable to contain the blaze, neighbors screaming about people trapped inside. He found Min-ji's body the next morning, pulled from the rubble of what used to be their home. The authorities investigated. Questions were asked that everyone knew would lead nowhere. And Jun-suk learned the most devastating lesson of his young life. In this world, love was a weakness that monsters would exploit without hesitation. From that day forward, Lee Jun-suk built an empire on the ashes of his heart. He became ruthless because anything less meant death. He became feared because fear commanded respect. And he became alone because alone meant no one could ever be used to hurt him again. For 2 decades, those walls stood impenetrable. No amount of begging, bargaining, or threatening had ever made Lee Jun-suk show mercy when there was no profit in it. He had eliminated rivals who pleaded for their lives. He had foreclosed on businesses while owners collapsed in despair. He had sent men to prison while their families sobbed in the galleries. But now, staring down at this little black girl who reminds him so painfully of the sister he couldn't save, those walls begin to fracture. The child's grip tightens on his sleeve. Her voice breaks into ragged sobs as she tries to explain what happened. Through her tears, Jun-suk begins piecing together a story that makes cold fury ignite in his veins. The little girl's name is Nia. Her father, Marcus Williams, runs a small convenience store in Itaewon, the international district of Seoul. They came to Korea from America 3 years ago, just father and daughter trying to build an honest life in a foreign country where honest lives aren't always safe. But their shop sits on a street claimed by a rogue trafficking operation. Criminals who demand protection money from immigrant business owners and prey on those who can't fight back. Marcus Williams had tried to comply, tried to pay what they demanded. But this week, the demands increased beyond what his struggling shop could possibly afford. And when he refused to let them use his store as a front for their operation, they decided to send him a message the neighborhood would never forget. Nia's words tumble out in a torrent, punctuated by hiccups and gasps for air. She describes how the men came to the shop just before closing time, how they dragged her father into a van while she hid behind the counter, how they laughed and said things in Korean she didn't fully understand but knew meant her daddy was never coming home. And then Nia describes something that makes even Jun-suk's hardened lieutenants shift uncomfortably in their seats. After taking her father, the men ransacked the store, smashing everything her father had worked so hard to build. They warned that if anyone talked to the police, they would come back for the little girl too. When they finally drove away, Nia crawled out from her hiding place. She was alone in a destroyed shop in a country where she barely spoke the language, with no mother and now no father. But she remembered something her daddy had told her once, that if you're ever in real trouble in Seoul, you find the powerful people, because only power can fight power. So the 6-year-old girl ran. She ran through neighborhoods she didn't know, asking strangers in broken Korean where to find the boss. Someone pointed her toward Gangnam. Someone else told her about the Red Dragon restaurant. And Nia Williams, terrified and desperate, decided to walk straight into the dragon's den. Now here she stands, clutching the arm of the most dangerous man in Seoul. Her last hope wrapped in expensive fabric and inked with symbols of violence. Jun-suk looks at her tear-stained face, at the pink dress that stands out like a flower in a graveyard, at the innocence that somehow found its way into his fortress of darkness. And for the first time in 20 years, the monster of Seoul feels something other than ice in his chest. To understand the magnitude of what happens next, you need to understand who Lee Jun-suk really is in the hierarchy of Seoul's criminal underworld. The meeting Nia had interrupted wasn't just another Tuesday business discussion. It was the monthly gathering of the 5 families, the most powerful criminal organizations in South Korea. Each family controlled different sectors of the city's underworld: gambling, construction, entertainment, import-export, and information. Together they had carved up Seoul like a cake, each taking their slice and respecting the boundaries. But respect in this world was never freely given. It was earned through blood, maintained through fear, and enforced through power. Lee Jun-suk sat at the apex of this pyramid. While the other 4 families operated as equals in theory, everyone in that room knew the truth. Jun-suk's network was the deepest, his resources the most extensive, his reputation the most terrifying. The Dragon of Gangnam, they called him. Not because he wore the tattoo, but because his reach extended everywhere. His eyes saw everything, and crossing him meant complete annihilation. The men seated around that corner booth represented decades of accumulated power. Kim Dae-jung controlled the gambling dens and underground casinos, a silver-haired patriarch who had survived 3 assassination attempts and emerged stronger each time. Park Sung-ho ran the construction and real estate operations, turning dirty money clean through legitimate developments that reshaped Seoul's skyline. Choi Min-woo managed the nightclubs and entertainment districts, a former street fighter who built an empire on pleasure and excess. And then there was Han Jae-sung, the youngest of the 5 at 42, a calculating intelligence broker who traded in secrets and information, always 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the game. These were not men who bowed to anyone. Yet when Jun-suk spoke, they listened. When he made a decision, they followed. When he drew a line, they respected it. The evening had started like all the others before it. They discussed territorial disputes in Hongdae where 2 smaller gangs were causing problems. They reviewed the monthly tribute from their subordinate organizations. They negotiated the terms of a new partnership with a Yakuza faction in Osaka. Every word was measured, every agreement sealed with the weight of unspoken consequences for betrayal. Jun-suk had been in the middle of addressing a delicate situation involving a politician who was becoming problematic when the door exploded open. His hand had been wrapped around a glass of premium whiskey. His voice low and steady as he explained exactly how the politician's corruption would be leveraged to their advantage. And then everything stopped. The men at the table had seen many things in their violent careers. They had witnessed executions, survived gang wars, orchestrated operations that would make ordinary citizens lose sleep for years. But none of them had ever seen a 6-year-old child in a torn pink dress burst into their sanctuary of darkness, run past $1 million worth of security, and grab Lee Jun-suk's arm like he was her only hope of survival. Kim Dae-jung's eyes went wide with disbelief. Park Sung-ho's hand moved reflexively toward his weapon before he caught himself. Choi Min-woo leaned back in his seat, watching the unprecedented scene unfold with something between fascination and horror. Han Jae-sung's calculating mind was already working through the implications, the angles, the possibilities of what this disruption might mean. But it was the bodyguard's reactions that revealed just how extraordinary this moment was. The security team that surrounded Jun-suk were the best in Seoul, former special forces operators who had been trained to eliminate threats without hesitation. Their hands were on their weapons, their bodies tense, ready to remove this intrusion with lethal efficiency if necessary. Yet Jun-suk hadn't given the signal. His hand remained steady on the table, whiskey glass untouched. His eyes were fixed on the sobbing child clutching his sleeve. And in the underground world where every gesture carried meaning, his stillness spoke volumes. The other family heads exchanged glances. Something was happening here, something none of them had anticipated. The monster of Seoul, the man who had once thrown a rival's lieutenant off a building for interrupting a phone call, was allowing this child to touch him, to plead with him, to break every rule of their carefully constructed hierarchy. And in that silence, they all understood that whatever came next would change everything. The head of security, a scarred veteran named Kong, would later replay the evening in his mind 1,000 times, trying to understand how a 6-year-old girl had penetrated 5 layers of protection designed to stop trained assassins. It had started at the restaurant's outer perimeter, where 2 spotters monitored every person approaching the building. They had seen the child wandering down the street, dirty and crying, but dismissed her as just another lost kid in a city full of them. When she turned toward the Red Dragon's entrance, they assumed she was looking for help and would be turned away at the door. The doorman, a former boxer named Lee, had tried exactly that. He'd stepped in front of Nia with his massive frame, ready to redirect her to a police station or shelter. But then she'd looked up at him with those tear-filled eyes and said in broken Korean, "Please, bad men take my daddy. Need boss. Please." Something in her desperation made him hesitate. That hesitation cost him 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Nia had slipped past him with the determination of a child who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Inside, the maitre d' had moved to intercept her, already apologizing profusely for the disruption. But Nia was small, fast, and driven by pure survival instinct. She ducked under his reaching hands and ran deeper into the restaurant, her pink dress a flash of color through the dimly lit space. By the time Kang's internal security team registered the breach, Nia was already weaving between tables. Her eyes locked on the private booth at the back where power itself sat in expensive suits. The bodyguards stationed near Jun-suk's table had moved to block her, hands reaching for weapons, training screaming at them to neutralize the threat. But then she'd reached them. This tiny, sobbing child in a torn pink dress, covered in dirt and tears, looking up at men whose very presence made grown criminals cross the street. And she hadn't stopped. She'd pushed through them like they were ghosts, her small hands reaching desperately for the tattooed man at the center of it all. No gun could have done what those tears did. No knife, no bomb, no threat could have frozen Lee Jun-suk the way that child's broken voice did when she grabbed his arm and sobbed, "My daddy's gone forever." Jun-suk stared at her, his mind working through scenarios and possibilities while his chest did something it hadn't done in 2 decades. It ached. The pink of her dress was so vibrant against the darkness of his world, so painfully innocent in this place where innocence came to die. His lieutenants waited, their tension thick enough to cut. The other family heads watched with predatory interest, already calculating what this moment of weakness might mean for future negotiations. The bodyguards stood frozen, awaiting orders that would determine whether this child lived or died in the next 60 seconds. But Jun-suk couldn't look away from her face. Dirt smudged across her brown skin, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime. Natural curls wild and tangled from running through the streets of a foreign city, searching for someone, anyone with enough power to undo whatever nightmare had taken her father. She had chosen him. Out of all the people in Seoul, all the authorities and officials and organizations, this 6-year-old girl had somehow found her way to the one man who actually could move heaven and hell if he decided to. And she was still holding his sleeve, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric like it was the only solid thing left in her collapsing world. Jun-suk's voice, when he finally spoke, was so quiet that everyone in the booth had to lean forward to hear it. But the words carried the weight of absolute authority that made empires rise and fall. "Tell me everything." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a command. It was the voice of a man who had just made a decision that would ripple through Seoul's underworld like an earthquake. Nia hiccuped, trying to control her sobs enough to speak. Her small voice trembled as she began, switching between English and broken Korean, painting a picture that made Jun-suk's jaw tighten with each word. And as she spoke, something became clear to everyone watching. The monster of Seoul hadn't just allowed this interruption. He had decided to care about it. And when Lee Jun-suk decided to care about something, the entire city should start preparing for war. The other family heads recognized the shift in Jun-suk's expression, and it unsettled them. They had known him for over 15 years, had watched him build his empire from the ashes of a tragedy most of them only whispered about. They knew the man sitting before them was forged in a fire so hot it had burned away everything soft, everything human, everything that could be exploited. Lee Jun-suk hadn't always been the dragon of Gangnam. Once, he'd been a 17-year-old boy named Jun who believed that hard work and loyalty could overcome any obstacle. He'd believed in heroes, in justice, in the idea that good people who did good things would eventually be rewarded. His parents had taught him that. His father worked 16-hour days at a textile factory. His mother cleaned offices in the wealthy neighborhoods they could never afford to live in. They were honest people trying to raise honest children in Seoul's forgotten slums, telling Jun and his younger sister Minji that their suffering was temporary, that education and perseverance would lift them out of poverty. Minji had believed them completely. At 12 years old, she studied by candlelight when the electricity was cut off, memorized English vocabulary while eating plain rice for dinner, dreamed of becoming a doctor who would treat people too poor to afford hospitals. She was everything pure and hopeful in a world designed to crush both those qualities. Jun had worked construction jobs after school to pay for her books, her uniform, the tutoring she needed to compete with students from wealthy families. He'd promised her that one day they would live somewhere safe, somewhere bright, somewhere far from the violence and desperation that infected their neighborhood like a disease. But promises meant nothing when powerful men decided your neighborhood was in their way. The fire had started on a Tuesday night in winter. Jun had been working late, carrying bags of cement up 15 flights of stairs because the construction elevator was broken. He'd been thinking about Minji's upcoming exam, about the English dictionary he was saving to buy her, about the look on her face when she'd hugged him goodbye that morning. He came home to find his entire block engulfed in flames. Firefighters were there, but their hoses seemed pathetic against the inferno consuming building after building. Neighbors screamed about people trapped inside, about children who couldn't escape, about doors that had been mysteriously locked from the outside. Jun had run toward the flames, had tried to force his way into the building where his family lived. Strong hands pulled him back. Voices told him it was suicide, that no one could survive that heat. He'd fought them, screaming Minji's name until his throat bled, until smoke inhalation dropped him to his knees. They found her body 2 days later, curled in the corner of what used to be their apartment. The official report called it an electrical fire, a tragic accident in a building with poor wiring and insufficient safety measures. The unofficial truth, whispered in the streets, was that a rising gang had decided to clear the area for a development project, and the quickest way to empty buildings was to make them uninhabitable. 17 people died in those flames. The police investigated for exactly 2 weeks before declaring the case closed. No arrests were made. No compensation was given. The land was sold 3 months later to a development company with ties to organized crime, and luxury apartments rose from the ashes where Minji had dreamed of becoming a doctor. That's when Lee Jun-suk learned the most important lesson of his life. There were no heroes coming to save you. There was no justice waiting at the end of suffering. There was only power and those who lacked it. And if you wanted to protect anything in this world, you needed to become more ruthless than the monsters who would take it from you. He'd spent the next 20 years building exactly that. He'd started as muscle for a mid-level gang, absorbing every lesson in violence and control. He'd learned to read people, to exploit weakness, to show mercy only when it served a strategic purpose. He'd climbed over bodies and broken alliances, constructing walls around his heart brick by bloody brick. By the time he was 30, he controlled Gangnam. By 35, he was the most feared criminal in Seoul. And he'd done it all by following one simple code. Never let anyone close enough to hurt you, never show weakness, and never, ever let emotion override calculation. For 20 years, that code had kept him alive, powerful, and utterly alone. Until a 6-year-old girl in a pink dress grabbed his arm and reminded him of every promise he'd failed to keep to the sister he couldn't save. The Williams family convenience store sat on a narrow street in Itaewon, squeezed between a halal restaurant and a used electronics shop. Jun-suk arrived there 40 minutes after Nia had collapsed, exhausted, in the back seat of his car, still clutching his sleeve even in sleep. He'd left her with Han Jae-sung's wife, the only woman in their circle he trusted with something so fragile. The other family heads had dispersed with silent nods, understanding that whatever was about to happen would reshape their carefully balanced world. They would wait for his call. Now Jun-suk stood outside the shop, and even from the street he could see the violence that had occurred inside. The security gate was bent, forced upward with crowbars that had left deep scratches in the metal. The glass door beyond was shattered, fragments glittering on the pavement like scattered diamonds. Kong and 2 other men flanked him, their eyes scanning the street for threats. This neighborhood was technically neutral territory, a buffer zone where multiple organizations operated without claiming ownership. That made it perfect for predators who wanted to hunt without drawing attention from the major families. Jun-suk pushed through the damaged door, and the destruction inside made his jaw tighten. This wasn't robbery. This was a message written in vandalism and terror. Shelves had been overturned, their contents scattered across the floor in a chaos of broken bottles and crushed packages. The cash register lay on its side, empty and dented. Cigarette displays had been ripped from the wall. The small refrigerator units had been tipped over, their doors hanging open, spoiled food spreading a sour smell through the stale air. But it was the blood that told the real story. Dark stains marked the floor near the counter, a considerable amount that spoke of serious injury. Drag marks led from that spot toward the back door, as if someone had been pulled unconscious through the debris. Jun-suk knelt beside the largest stain, his fingers hovering just above the dried blood without touching it. Marcus Williams had fought. The overturned displays near the front suggested he'd tried to use them as barriers. The broken mop handle, snapped in 2, indicated he'd grabbed whatever weapon he could reach. The man had fought to protect his daughter, to protect the life they'd built in this foreign city, and he'd lost. Jun-suk stood, his eyes methodically cataloging every detail. On the wall behind the counter, family photos hung in crooked frames, somehow having survived the destruction. Marcus Williams smiled in each one, a tall man with kind eyes and his arm around a little girl in various stages of growing up. Beach trips, birthday parties, first day of school, a life documented in snapshots of joy. One photo showed Marcus and Nia in front of this very store on opening day, both of them beaming with pride and hope. The American Dream, Korean edition. Work hard, build something, give your child a better life than you had. Jun-suk had seen 1,000 sob stories in his career. People begged him for help every week, claimed they were victims of circumstances beyond their control, promised they'd pay him back if he just intervened this once. He'd learned to tune out the desperation, to see through the manipulation, to recognize that most people's problems were consequences of their own poor choices. But this was different. Marcus Williams hadn't borrowed from loan sharks. He hadn't gambled away money he didn't have. He hadn't tried to play both sides of a gang conflict. He'd simply refused to let criminals use his legitimate business as a front for human trafficking, and they'd punished him for having principles. Kong appeared from the back room, his expression dark. "Boss, you need to see this." The small office behind the store was in worse condition than the front. The desk had been overturned, papers scattered everywhere. But what Kong was pointing to made Jun-suk's blood run cold with fury. On the wall, written in what looked like Marcus's own blood, was a message in crude Korean. "This is what happens to those who refuse the family." Family. Not a family but the family. It was a term used by organized operations to intimidate, to claim legitimacy they didn't possess, to make victims think resistance was futile. Jun-suk pulled out his phone and photographed the message, the bloodstains, the destruction. Then he made a call that would activate every resource in his considerable network. "Find out who's running protection schemes in Itaewon," he said quietly into the phone. "Find out who's using the word family to scare immigrant shopkeepers. And find out where they're holding Marcus Williams." He paused, looking at the photo of the smiling father and daughter on opening day. And make it clear, he added, his voice dropping to a tone that had made powerful men reconsider their life choices, that they just made the worst mistake of their miserable lives. Within 2 hours, Lee Jun-suk had mobilized a network that most government agencies would envy. The machinery of Seoul's underworld, built over decades through blood and loyalty, turned its focus toward finding one missing shopkeeper. And when the Dragon of Gangnam demanded answers, the entire city started talking. Han Jae-sung's information brokers hit the streets first, spreading money and threats in equal measure. They talked to taxi drivers who worked the Itaewon routes, to street vendors who saw everything but said nothing, to the working girls who knew which men bragged about their crimes after too much soju. Every conversation yielded fragments of information that Han's analysts assembled like puzzle pieces. Choi Min-woo's nightclub network activated next. His managers made calls to bouncers, bartenders, and hosts across 100 establishments, asking about any crews who'd been flashing unusual amounts of cash or celebrating recent scores. In Choi's world, violence always preceded celebration, and men who hurt people always needed to brag about it eventually. Park Sung-ho sent his construction crews to canvass the industrial areas, checking abandoned warehouses and building sites where people could be held without neighbors hearing screams. His foreman had contacts in every district, workers who knew which properties were empty, which had been recently accessed, which attracted the kind of traffic that didn't belong. Even Kim Dae-young, the eldest of the 5 families, contributed resources. His casino enforcers reached out to the loan sharks and small-time criminals who operated at the edges of organized crime, the desperate men who sometimes took jobs from operations too dirty for the established families to touch. But it was Jun-suk's own network that cut deepest. His lieutenants activated informants in the police force, bureaucrats who owed favors, customs officials who looked the other way for the right price. They pulled surveillance footage from traffic cameras. They checked shipping manifests at the port. They interviewed every shopkeeper in Itaewon who'd been approached by protection rackets in the last 6 months. The picture that emerged made Jun-suk's anger transform into something colder and more dangerous than rage. It became purpose. The trafficking operation was run by a crew of former gang members who'd been expelled from their organizations for crossing lines even criminals considered sacred. They called themselves the Black Lotus Syndicate, a pretentious name for a collection of thugs who specialized in exploiting immigrants and foreign workers. They targeted people who didn't speak Korean well, who didn't understand their legal rights, who feared deportation more than they feared violence. Marcus Williams fit their pattern perfectly. A Black American running a small business, isolated from his community, raising a daughter alone. When he'd refused to let them use his shop as a pickup location for their trafficking victims, they decided to make an example of him. They'd beaten him unconscious, taken him to their holding facility, and planned to sell him to a labor trafficking ring that supplied illegal workers to fishing vessels operating in international waters. Once on those ships, people disappeared. No records, no rescue, no hope. Jun-suk received this information while standing in his office overlooking the glittering lights of Gangnam. Behind him, a massive window framed Seoul like a kingdom he ruled from the shadows. Before him, Han Jae-sung presented the intelligence with clinical precision. "They're operating out of a warehouse near Incheon Port," Han said, sliding a satellite photo across the desk. "The building is registered to a shell company, but we've confirmed unusual activity. Trucks arriving late at night. Men standing guard who aren't legitimate security. And witnesses report hearing sounds consistent with people being held against their will." Jun-suk studied the photo, his mind already calculating approach vectors, exit routes, potential complications. The warehouse was isolated, which meant the Black Lotus felt safe there. That confidence would be their downfall. "How many men?" Jun-suk asked. "Best estimate, 8 to 12 guarding the facility. Their leadership, 3 brothers named the Beck brothers, are likely inside. They handle the high-value acquisitions personally." Jun-suk nodded slowly. In his younger days, he might have sent a team to handle this quietly. But something had shifted in him since Nia grabbed his sleeve. This wasn't about maintaining order or protecting territory. This was about a promise he'd made to a terrified child. This was about being the hero he'd stopped believing in 20 years ago. "Assemble everyone," he said quietly. "We move tonight." Han raised an eyebrow. "Everyone." Jun-suk's expression was carved from ice and fury. "I want them to understand what happens when you hurt children. I want every criminal in this city to know that there are still lines you don't cross." He picked up his phone and made one more call, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Tell the Black Lotus that the dragon is coming for them. And tell them to pray." The warehouse squatted at the edge of Incheon port like a rusted wound, surrounded by shipping containers that cast long shadows under the industrial lights. At 2:47 a.m., the facility was supposed to be silent, just another forgotten building in a district full of them. But inside, men were preparing for a shipment that would leave Korea before dawn. Jun-suk watched from the shadows across the street, flanked by 20 of his most trusted operatives. These weren't the soldiers who collected debts or managed territory disputes. These were the men who handled situations where violence was the only language that mattered, former military specialists who'd found more lucrative employment in the underworld. Kong crouched beside him, thermal imaging equipment revealing heat signatures inside the warehouse. 12 hostiles confirmed. 3 heat signatures in the back container, likely the holding area. One of them matches the size profile for Marcus Williams. 2 others, Jun-suk thought grimly. Marcus wasn't the only victim waiting to disappear into the dark machinery of human trafficking. How many families had the Black Lotus destroyed? How many children had cried themselves to sleep wondering if their parents would ever come home? "The ship?" Jun-suk asked quietly. "Docked 200 meters east. Chinese-flagged cargo vessel. Scheduled to depart at 5 a.m. If we don't move in the next hour, they'll transfer the prisoners and we'll lose them to international waters." Jun-suk checked his watch. They had time but not much. He deliberately waited until the last possible moment, wanting the Black Lotus to feel safe, to let their guard down while they counted money and congratulated themselves on another successful abduction. He signaled to his teams. They moved like smoke through the darkness, spreading out to cover every exit. No one would escape. No one would raise an alarm. This would be surgical, brutal, and absolute. The attack began without warning. Jun-suk's breach team hit the main entrance with a battering ram that sounded like thunder in the quiet night. The door exploded inward, and his men poured through the opening with military precision. The first 2 Black Lotus guards barely had time to register the intrusion before they were on the ground, disarmed and unconscious. The third managed to pull his weapon, but a bullet from Kang's pistol, equipped with a suppressor, dropped him before he could fire. Jun-suk moved through the chaos with cold efficiency, his eyes scanning for the Beck brothers. Gunfire erupted from the second floor, muzzle flashes illuminating panicked faces. His men returned fire with controlled bursts, advancing through the warehouse like a wave of inevitable violence. One of the brothers, the youngest, Baek Min-ho, tried to run toward the back exit. He made it 3 steps before Jun-suk intercepted him, grabbing him by the throat and slamming him against a shipping container hard enough to dent the metal. "Where are the prisoners?" Jun-suk's voice was quiet, but it carried more menace than any scream. Baek Min-ho's eyes widened with recognition and terror. You're the dragon. This isn't your territory. You have no right." Jun-suk tightened his grip. "Wrong answer." The man's face turned purple as he gasped for air. "Back container. Blue 1. Please." Jun-suk released him, letting him collapse to the ground choking. 2 of his men secured the brother with zip ties while Jun-suk moved toward the blue container at the rear of the warehouse. The container's door was padlocked with heavy chains. Jun-suk didn't hesitate. He pulled out his pistol and shot the lock twice, the metal shattering under the impact. He wrenched the door open, and the smell that hit him made his jaw clench with renewed fury. Sweat, blood, fear, and human waste. The smell of people treated like cargo. Inside, 3 figures huddled against the far wall, shielding their eyes from the sudden light. Two women, both appearing to be in their 20s, and a man slumped between them, his face swollen and bloodied beyond immediate recognition. But Jun-suk recognized the build, the clothing Nia had described. Marcus Williams had been beaten savagely, his face a mass of bruises, his breathing shallow and labored. The women were supporting him, keeping him upright, their own faces marked with the evidence of violence. "Medical now," Jun-suk barked over his shoulder. Within seconds, his team's medic was inside the container, assessing Marcus's injuries with practiced hands. "He's alive," the medic reported. "Severe trauma, possible internal bleeding. Definitely needs a hospital immediately." Behind them, the sounds of combat had ceased. Jun-suk's men had secured the warehouse completely. The surviving Black Lotus members were on their knees, hands bound, facing the reality that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Jun-suk knelt beside Marcus Williams, gently touching the unconscious man's shoulder. "Your daughter is safe," he said quietly, though he didn't know if Marcus could hear him. "Nia is safe. And you're going home to her tonight." Marcus's eyes flickered open, just for a moment, confusion and pain mixing with something that might have been hope. Then they closed again as the medics loaded him onto a stretcher. Jun-suk stood and walked back to where the Beck brothers were being held. All three were now on their knees, bloodied and terrified, finally understanding that their victims had found a protector more ruthless than they could ever be. "Take them to the warehouse in Bucheon," Jun-suk said to Kong. His voice carried a cold finality. "I'll deal with them personally after Marcus Williams is safely in the hospital." The message would spread through Seoul's underworld by morning. The dragon had drawn a line in blood, and anyone who hurt the innocent would face consequences more terrible than prison or death. Seoul National University Hospital was quiet at 6 in the morning, the halls filled with that peculiar stillness that exists between the night shift's exhaustion and the day shift's arrival. Jun-suk walked through those halls like he belonged there, his expensive suit replaced with a simple black sweater and slacks, his usual entourage reduced to just Kong waiting in the parking garage. He'd spent the hours between the rescue and dawn handling the Beck brothers personally. The details of what happened in that Bucheon warehouse would never be spoken aloud, but the surviving members of the Black Lotus Syndicate would carry the memory in their nightmares for whatever remained of their miserable lives. By sunrise, the organization had been completely dismantled, its assets seized, its operations permanently shut down. But none of that mattered as much as what was happening in room 504. Jun-suk had arranged for Marcus Williams to receive the best care available. The hospital's director, a man who owed Jun-suk several favors, had personally assembled the trauma team. Marcus had undergone emergency surgery to repair internal bleeding, had received treatment for his fractured ribs and facial injuries, and was now stable, sedated, but alive. Nia didn't know any of this yet. Han Jae-sung's wife had kept her safe and distracted, letting her sleep, feeding her breakfast, telling her that powerful people were looking for her father. The little girl had cried herself to exhaustion twice, had asked 100 times if her daddy was okay, had clutched a stuffed rabbit someone had bought her like it was the only solid thing in her collapsing world. Now Jun-suk stood outside room 504, and through the small window in the door, he could see Marcus Williams lying in the hospital bed, his face still swollen and bandaged, but breathing steadily. Life. Against all odds, against the cruelty of men who saw human beings as commodities, Marcus Williams would go home to his daughter. Jun-suk had asked Han's wife to bring Nia to the hospital at 6:30. It was 6:28 now. He could hear them coming down the hallway, Nia's small voice asking questions in rapid-fire English mixed with broken Korean, Han's wife answering with gentle patience. Then Nia rounded the corner and saw Jun-suk standing there. Her eyes went wide with recognition and desperate hope. She ran to him without hesitation, grabbing his hand with both of hers. "Did you find him? Did you find my daddy? Is he okay? Please tell me he's okay." Jun-suk knelt down to her eye level, something he'd never done for anyone in 20 years. He looked into those brown eyes that had somehow broken through walls he thought were impenetrable. Your father is in this room, he said gently. He's hurt, but he's going to be okay. The doctors fixed him up. He's sleeping right now, but he's safe. Nia's face crumpled with relief so profound it was almost pain. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but these were different from the desperate sobs in the restaurant. These were tears of release, of a burden too heavy for a 6-year-old finally being lifted. Can I see him? She whispered. Jun-suk opened the door. Nia approached the hospital bed slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast might shatter the miracle. She stared at her father's bandaged face, at the 4 lines and monitors, at the gentle rise and fall of his chest. Then she carefully climbed onto the chair beside the bed and took his hand in both of hers. Daddy, she whispered. I found help. Found the boss. He saved you. Marcus's eyes flickered open, unfocused at first from the pain medication. Then they found his daughter's face, and something that might have been a smile tried to form on his swollen lips. Nia, baby. His voice was rough, barely audible. You're safe. You're safe too, Daddy. The nice boss man saved you. He saved you. Marcus's gaze shifted to Jun-suk, standing silently near the door. Their eyes met, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them. A father's gratitude to the man who'd returned his daughter's world to her, a protector's acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be repaid. Jun-suk nodded once, then turned to leave, giving them privacy for their reunion. But before he could exit, Marcus's weak voice stopped him. Thank you. I don't know why you helped us. But thank you. Jun-suk paused in the doorway, looking back at the father and daughter holding hands beside the hospital bed. He thought about Minji, about promises broken and lives destroyed, about 20 years spent believing that caring about anything made you weak. Just get better, he said quietly. Focus on healing. Everything else is handled. Outside in the hallway, he found the hospital's billing department head waiting nervously. Jun-suk handed him an envelope containing enough cash to cover every expense, every treatment, every day of recovery Marcus would need. Make sure they want for nothing, he said. And if anyone asks who paid, tell them it was an anonymous donor. The man nodded quickly and disappeared. Jun-suk walked back toward the elevator, past nurses starting their morning rounds, past families waiting for visiting hours, past the ordinary people living ordinary lives that he'd spent 20 years believing himself separate from. But as the elevator doors closed, he caught his reflection in the polished steel and saw something he hadn't seen in 2 decades. A man who'd chosen to be a hero instead of a monster, even if just for one night, even if just for one little girl who'd grabbed his sleeve and reminded him that some promises were worth keeping. 6 months later, the Williams family convenience store had been completely rebuilt. The shattered glass was replaced with reinforced security windows. The bent security gate was upgraded to a modern system that Marcus could control from his phone. The shelves that had been destroyed were now stocked with products from Korea, America, and a dozen other countries, catering to Itaewon's diverse international community. But the real changes were invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Marcus Williams stood behind his counter on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, ringing up a customer's purchase of instant ramen and sports drinks. His face had healed, though faint scars remained as reminders of that terrible night. He moved a bit slower now, favoring his left side where the ribs had been broken, but the doctor said he'd make a full recovery with time. Nia sat at a small table in the corner doing her homework, her natural curls pulled back with a bright yellow headband. She was 7 now, enrolled in an international school that cost more than Marcus could have afforded on his own. When he'd protested the anonymous scholarship that appeared in her name, the school administrator had simply said that certain benefactors believed in investing in exceptional children. Marcus knew who that benefactor was, even if the man never acknowledged it. The customer left, and Marcus glanced out the window at the street. To most people, Itaewon looked the same as it always had, busy, vibrant, full of restaurants and shops catering to Seoul's international population. But Marcus noticed the differences. He noticed the 2 men in casual clothes who always seemed to be nearby, one reading a newspaper at the cafe across the street, another browsing the electronics shop next door. He noticed how no one approached his store asking for protection money anymore. He noticed how the street vendors greeted him with respect that bordered on deference. Most of all, he noticed the black sedan that drove past his shop twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, never stopping but always slowing just enough for the driver to verify that everything was as it should be. Lee Jun-suk rarely visited in person. Twice in 6 months, he'd stopped by just before closing time, each visit brief and seemingly casual. He'd purchase a bottle of water, exchange a few words with Marcus about business being good, nod to Nia who would beam at him like he was a superhero, and then disappear back into the city's shadows. But Marcus understood what those visits meant. They were statements, declarations written in the unspoken language of Seoul's underworld. This shop, this family, this little piece of Itaewon, they were under the dragon's protection. And everyone in the criminal ecosystem understood that harming them would bring consequences more terrible than death. The word had spread through every gang, every crew, every small-time operation. The monster of Seoul had drawn a line, and that line was drawn around a convenience store owned by a black American shopkeeper and his daughter. No one dared cross it. Marcus had tried to thank Jun-suk during one of those visits, had tried to express gratitude that words couldn't fully capture. Jun-suk had simply shaken his head and said, "Just take care of your daughter. That's all the thanks I need." Now, as the afternoon sun slanted through the shop windows, Nia looked up from her homework and called out, "Daddy, can I have a snack?" Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that only comes from a man who knows how close he came to losing everything. "What do you want, baby girl?" "Those honey butter chips. And maybe some banana milk." As Marcus retrieved the items from the shelf, he heard the familiar sound of the black sedan driving past outside. He glanced through the window and saw Kong behind the wheel, eyes scanning the street with professional vigilance. Their eyes met briefly, and Kong gave an almost imperceptible nod before continuing down the street. Marcus handed Nia her snack and watched her bounce back to her homework, completely unaware of the invisible shield that surrounded her. She still remembered that terrible night, still had nightmares sometimes about men taking her daddy away. But she also remembered the tattooed man who'd listened to her desperate plea, who'd moved heaven and hell to bring her father back. The nice boss man, she called him. She'd drawn him a picture once, a child's crayon rendering of a stern figure with dragon tattoos, and Marcus had nearly wept when she insisted they mail it to him. They didn't have an address, but somehow the picture had disappeared from the counter the next time Jun-suk had visited, tucked into his jacket pocket without comment. Marcus turned back to his register and noticed something new on the bulletin board beside it, a business card that had appeared sometime in the last week. No name, just a phone number and a simple message in Korean and English. "If you need help, call." He didn't know when it had been placed there or by whom, but he knew what it meant. The Dragon of Gangnam, the most feared criminal in Seoul, had appointed himself the guardian of a little convenience store in Itaewon. And for the first time since arriving in Korea, Marcus Williams felt truly safe. Across the city, in a penthouse office overlooking Gangnam, Lee Jun-suk stood at his window watching the sun set over Seoul. His empire ran as efficiently as ever. His power remained absolute. His reputation still made strong men nervous. But something fundamental had changed. The walls he'd built around his heart hadn't crumbled. They'd transformed into something different. Not walls to keep everyone out, but boundaries that protected what mattered while letting in the light. He thought about Minji often now, without the crushing guilt that used to accompany her memory. He couldn't save his sister, but he'd saved Nia's father. And in doing so, he'd saved something in himself he thought had died in those flames 20 years ago. The phone on his desk buzzed. Business as usual, territory disputes to mediate, deals to approve, problems to solve. The Dragon of Gangnam had work to do. But first, he pulled out his phone and checked the report from the team watching the Williams family convenience store. All quiet. Father and daughter safe. Another ordinary day in a life he'd fought to preserve. Jun-suk allowed himself a small smile, something his lieutenants would have been shocked to witness. Then he turned back to his empire, no longer a man who ruled through fear alone, but a silent guardian who'd finally found his soul in the tears of a little girl in a pink dress.